Today we'll speak to you about the forced labor involved with human trafficking, starting with child labor. The long history of various forms of child labor exploitation, including indentured servitude, involuntary servitude, debt bondage, and more recently, labor trafficking cases in the United States, demonstrate that these cases in fact do exist, and there are many other reasons for the lack of identification, reporting, investigations, and prosecutions of such cases. There is a long unfortunate historical legacy of children, boys and girls, being exploited for labor in the United States. In early American history, much labor was organized under a system of bonded labor known as indentured servitude. This typically lasted for several years and was often means of using labor to pay the cost of transporting people, including large numbers of children and youth from England and Northern Europe to the 13 colonies of the United States. Children forced to work in homes as domestic servants on farms in agricultural environments continued to exist, even in the post-slavery era. In the formative involuntary servitude case, United States versus Lewis in 1986, all of the defendants named belonged to a cult named the House of Judah. As a part of the rules of the cult, corporal punishment was deemed proper and necessary. The House of Judah organized a compound in western Michigan, which included a farm. At the compound, children were not allowed to attend public school and could only attend school at camp, and were forced to work on the compound and follow strict rules, with guards patrolling the perimeter of the camp. There were incidents in which children were burned as punishment, and beatings were common for those who tried to run away or didn't do assigned work. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were severely beaten, and at least one boy was beaten to death. The school teacher was beaten and forced to show her wounds to the students, as were parents. Defendants argued that children living with parents could not become the slaves of someone else, that they were in the care of the property of the parents, and that could not therefore become property of others. The court ultimately held that due to the pervasive climate of fear existing in the camp, including children forced to watch their parents and teachers shamed and abused, the children were indeed victims of involuntary servitude. Labor traffickers often target homeless youth because they lack access to shelter, food, and personal connections, according to Gibbs et al. In 2015. Often promises of paid, legitimate employment are not realized. A survey conducted by the National Network for Youth in 2015 found that door-to-door trafficking sales rings had targeted runaway and homeless youth. These youth were lured by the promise of housing, employment, and food, but found themselves living in overcrowded motel rooms with other labor-trafficked youth, receiving little or no pay, and given unreasonable sales quotas. For example, in 2011, 24 children and young adults were lured to Orlando, Florida with promises of honest wages. Instead, they were crammed into the back of a van, driven around, and forced to sell cheap items and candy bars door-to-door and outside of gas stations. They worked 10-hour days and transported in unsafe conditions to unfamiliar neighborhoods. Their exploiters rationed their food and water. Police ultimately arrested 2 men in connection with this operation on labor trafficking charge, according to Gallup 2013. Local human rights activists and the Polaris Project, a national non-governmental organization running the NHTRC, state these sales crews targeting young people are a growing regional trend. Research has demonstrated that begging networks may conceal labor trafficking and exploit runaway youth, foster care youth, and other vulnerable populations at risk of sex trafficking, according to Dank 2011. In 2014, of the 9% of reported cases at NHTRC involving child labor trafficking, top forms of labor trafficking were traveling sales crew, begging, and peddling. Moving on to my next point, I will now discuss labor trafficking in the form of forced labor on tobacco industries in countries such as Malawi, Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Youth as young as 5 years old pick tobacco and are denied an education and basic food requirements in Malawi's tobacco growing sector. Children and adults are trafficked to tobacco farms both within Malawi and neighboring countries of Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Tobacco workers and their families remain impoverished through tobacco company workers, and their families remain impoverished through practices such as collusion over leaf prices and unfair contract arrangements with tobacco companies. The study of trafficked persons requires a critical approach to sensationalize modern-day slavery, narratives that circulate in tobacco control and human rights discourses. In 2015, Malawi made a moderate advancement in the Trafficking in Persons Act, which will address key gaps in its legal framework. The government also increased funding for its social cash transfer program and supported other social programs addressed to child labor, particularly in the tobacco sector. However, children in Malawi continue to engage in the worst forms of child labor, including the harvesting of tobacco and fishing. I will now discuss the case of Romanian women in the agricultural sector in Sicily. According to an article by Letizia Palumbo and Alessandra Serbia, titled Vulnerability to Forced Labor Trafficking, the cases of Romanian women in the agricultural sector in Sicily, drawing on fieldwork conducted in 2013 and 2014 with Romanian female farm workers in Ragusa. The paper identifies factors that contribute towards their vulnerability towards exploitation. By paying specific attention to the experience of women who are mothers with dependent children, we look at structural factors that increase their vulnerability and consider how this vulnerability forces women into situations whereby they effectively accept and or submit to abuse. These women face a combination of fundamental rights violations, including labor rights violations, which is based on the abuse of a particular position of vulnerability. Their vulnerability forces them to make an impossible choice between incomparable goods, leaving them with no viable alternative but to submit to the abuse. From this perspective, the experiences of the exploitation of these women can be regarded as cases of forced labor on the basis of indicators provided by the International Labor Organization, and as cases of trafficking according to the Directive of 2011, preventing and combating trafficking in human beings and prosecuting its victims. In conclusion, human trafficking in relation to forced labor is a serious epidemic, and that is speaking of cases that are known of, but there are an unknown amount of unknown cases. Now that we have discussed labor trafficking, we will now highlight the effects of human trafficking and how to help.